On July 1st, 2015, 6-month-old Ember Graham was staying with her father, Matthew, in Shasta County, California. According to Matthew, he fell asleep around 10:30 p.m., just feet away from his daughter. When he woke up just after 5 a.m. on July 2nd, Ember was gone. He called 911 and a large-scale search began. A few days later, Ember's pacifier was found miles away from her home, but there was no sign of her anywhere. For the last 9 years, law enforcement and Ember's family have never stopped searching, but she is still missing, leaving everyone asking the same question: where is baby Ember? Hey everyone, welcome back to Detective Perspective. My name is Derrick Levasseur. I'm a licensed private investigator and former police detective. Each week I'll be covering an unsolved case in story format. I'll then give you my perspective on the investigation and provide contact information for the individuals or organizations connected to the case so that if you have any tips, you can contact them directly and maybe you can help solve a case. So if you're someone who's interested in true crime, specifically unsolved cases, and you would like to hear my opinion on those investigations, please consider subscribing whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use. So we're discussing another child case, and you guys know how I feel about them. Absolutely despise them, but I know it's a part of the job. It's a necessary evil. If anything, if I had the stomach for it, all I would cover would be cases involving children because obviously, I have a soft spot. Being a father of 2 daughters, as a parent, I just can't imagine what it would be like to not know where my child is or if they're okay. And I would not wish it on my worst enemy. I know a lot of people say that and they're like, oh, you can't really mean that. If it's your worst enemy, you would wish that on them. No, I would not. This is a pain that I think is unimaginable unless you're actually in that position. And I hope and I pray that I never am. And as I start to go over the facts of this case, you may find yourself saying, I think I know what happened here. It doesn't seem like much of a mystery. Why is Derrick covering this? Well, the mystery is that as I sit here 9 years later, we do not know where Ember is. And I know that Ember's family is still actively searching for her, including using their Facebook page to try to drum up new leads. So as long as I'm breathing, if I have the capacity and the ability to cover these cases where families are just looking for help, even if it's just exposure about their case, that is something I'm going to do. So I hope you will join me in that search because as long as I'm doing these types of cases, as unfortunate as these stories are, I'm going to continue to cover them with the hope that one day we will get answers to what happened and those families will finally get the closure or at least the resolution that they're searching for. So yes, this is going to be a hard case to discuss. It's never easy to talk about an innocent baby, but it's what we have to do. These are the unfortunate circumstances we're presented with, and I want to give you the story so that you can come to your own conclusions, and maybe one of you out there can help. So with that all out of the way, let's dive into this week's case. Ember Skye Graham was born on December 19th, 2014 to her parents Jamie and Matthew. Ember was a happy baby who brought joy to everyone around her. Her maternal grandmother described her as funny and always laughing, while her paternal grandmother said Ember had her dad wrapped around her finger. Sadly, Ember was born with a seizure disorder that required medication twice a day. Jamie worked hard to make sure she never missed a dose, but Matthew struggled with the responsibility. His cousin Sarah later told Crime Watch Daily that Matthew had a wild side. He enjoyed partying, drinking, and smoking marijuana. Jamie's father also shared his thoughts on Matthew. He said, quote, "Hardly anybody had anything good to say about him. He either stole from them money or property, owed them money, borrowed this and never returned it. There wasn't a lot of love for that man in that town. I wouldn't say enemies, just a lot of people were pissed off at him." Jamie worried about Matthew's lifestyle, and to make matters worse, he wasn't just partying, he would also randomly come home and tell her he didn't want to be with her anymore. And this erratic behavior eventually led to them separating. Not long after, Matthew was arrested for drunk driving, and according to his cousin Sarah, this was the wake-up call he needed. He decided to turn his life around and he moved in with her on Nusha Lane in Anderson, California. Although they were no longer together, Jamie agreed to let Matthew stay in Ember's life. He made an effort to be more present for his daughter, and he started having overnight visits with her once a week or every other week. On July 1st of 2015, 6-month-old Ember went to stay with Matthew at his cousin Sarah's house for an overnight visit. According to Matthew, he put Ember to bed before turning in for the night around 10:30 p.m. But when he woke up just after 5 a.m. on July 2nd, the crib, which was only a few feet away from him, was empty. But instead of calling 911 right away, Matthew called his mother Sheila and Ember's mother Jamie. Sheila later told Crime Watch Daily about the call, stating, quote, "He said he woke up and went running into the front room and she wasn't there. I could hear the emotion and the fear in his voice and the not knowing where she was, and where was she?" At 5:26 a.m., Matthew finally called 911 and reported that Ember had been abducted in the middle of the night while he was sleeping. The police quickly responded to the call, and Jamie arrived shortly after. She later said, quote, "It was very strange. Matthew seemed like he was upset, but at the same time, it almost seemed kind of fake. He was crying, but it almost seemed like he was whining. It was very kind of forced, and it was really confusing." Jamie immediately began searching for Ember along with family members, law enforcement, and volunteers. Police dogs were brought in and search efforts expanded throughout Happy Valley and Shasta County. Detectives also searched the home where Matthew and his cousin Sarah lived, and it quickly became clear that an abduction was highly unlikely. We're going to get into that right after this break. Your nighttime bedroom temperature can have a huge impact on your sleep quality, so if you wake up too hot or too cold, I highly recommend you check out Miracle Made's bed sheets. Miracle Made sheets are inspired by NASA and uses silver-infused fabrics that are temperature regulating so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. Traditional bed sheets can harbor more bacteria than a toilet seat, which can lead to acne, allergies, and stuffy noses, and at minimum, it's just gross. Miracle Made offers a whole line of self-cleaning antibacterial bedding such as sheets, pillowcases, and comforters that prevent up to 99.7% of bacterial growth and require up to 3 times less cleaning. So yes, they're temperature regulating, they stay cleaner longer, but most importantly, they're comfortable. And I would say luxuriously comfortable, but without the high price tag of other luxury brands, and feel just as nice, if not nicer, than some sheets that you'd find in 5-star hotels. So if you want to check them out, go to trymiracle.com/detective to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use my promo code DETECTIVE at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. And Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. So upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made by going to trymiracle.com/detective and use my code DETECTIVE to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/detective, code DETECTIVE to treat yourself. Thank you to Miracle Made for sponsoring this episode. All right, we're back. So let's talk about Sarah's home, because that's the last place we know Ember was, and obviously that's where detectives were going to look. So the home was actually a 25-foot trailer. It was small, it was surrounded by 2 fences, and it was guarded by dogs. And it didn't even have a real door. Instead, it could be only pried open with a screwdriver, which obviously would make a lot of noise. Now, when you think about this, and you think about the possibility that someone broke in the middle of the night while Matthew and his cousin Sarah would be sleeping, how would the person or persons get into this trailer without waking them up? They would go inside, they would pry open this door with a screwdriver, making all this noise, go over to the crib, grab Ember, and nobody's going to notice. Nobody would hear a sound. So as an investigator, when I'm going into this property and I'm thinking about, okay, first off, they're going to have to approach the trailer. So they're going to have to get by the dogs without the dogs barking. Anybody out there who has a dog, whether it's a more aggressive dog or even a more docile dog, approach a house or a backyard at night while that dog is outside. Watch what happens. It's going to start barking. But maybe, if we're just trying to play devil's advocate, maybe Matthew and Sarah don't hear the dogs barking, or they bark so often that it doesn't really register to them. That's fine. But then, like I said, they got to pry open this door with a screwdriver. It's going to make noise. They don't hear that, and they got to walk through this trailer, which is only 25 feet. That's not a lot. And walk in and walk out without ever being detected. Very unlikely. Very unlikely, and I'm sure as an investigator, when they're in there, they're coming to the same conclusions. Now, as the search for Ember continued, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office began interviewing family members. Matthew's cousin Sarah told investigators that on the afternoon of July 1st, he asked if she needed anything from the Happy Stop gas station, which was just 5 minutes from their home. He then took Ember with him in the baby carrier and he left. Sarah said that Matthew was gone a little longer than usual, but when he returned with Ember, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But that was just her account. We're going to revisit this thought in a little bit, so just hold on to it for now. Now, Matthew told detectives that he and Ember returned home from the gas station trip. Later that night at around 10:30, he put her to bed and then he smoked some weed. He fell asleep, and when he woke up, she was missing. After hearing all of this, detectives went to the Happy Stop gas station on Cloverdale Road and pulled the surveillance footage. A camera inside the store confirmed that Ember, who had a pacifier in her mouth, was with Matthew at that time. This meant his story to Sarah about going to the gas station was accurate. But that's not where the story ends, because when detectives reviewed the outdoor cameras, they noticed that after Matthew left the store, he didn't turn toward home. Instead, he headed toward the Clear Creek water tower. As you would expect, detectives asked Matthew why he didn't go straight home, and he claimed that Ember had become agitated, so he took her for a drive to calm her down. And it is important to note that Matthew's truck was picked up on that same outdoor gas station camera again, but not until an hour later, and this time he was heading toward home. And I know a lot of you guys are probably asking this question right now, so I'll address it. Unfortunately, the camera angle was too far away to confirm whether or not Ember was still in the truck, and investigators had no way of knowing what Matthew had done during that missing hour, or if Ember was still with him at the end of it all. And so, as you would expect, detectives go back at Matthew and they want to ask him more questions about what he was doing during that hour, and according to what I've read, Matthew said he couldn't remember. And obviously, this is a problem. It's a huge red flag, because at this point, the only person we have accounting for Ember and putting her back at the home with Matthew is his cousin Sarah. And although it doesn't happen all the time, it's not uncommon for a relative to lie for another relative, especially if they're close. So we don't have any concrete evidence that Ember was actually with Matthew, and when he's being kind of cagey about his whereabouts during that hour to the point where he's saying he doesn't remember, that's an issue, because he should remember. Even if he was just driving around, he should understand what areas he visited while driving with her, and the fact that he's being dodgy about it, it's not a good sign. It's not a good sign for the overall investigation. And I'm sure you guys are having a visceral reaction to Matthew's lack of memory, the same reaction that I'm having inside, and I'm happy to report that detectives also felt the same way, because they questioned Matthew for 8 hours, and they later told Crime Watch Daily that during that time he offered, quote, little or no assistance to help clear himself, and that, quote, at no time did he ever inquire what was being done to find Ember. And they didn't just question him for 8 hours, they also asked him to submit to a voice stress test, and he declined, and then he asked for a lawyer. So obviously the questioning stopped at that point. So by the end of this interview, 23-year-old Matthew Graham was officially a person of interest in his daughter's disappearance. Detectives didn't have enough to charge him, but since he did admit to smoking weed, they arrested him on a probation violation related to a previous drunk driving conviction. The sheriff's office then publicly identified Matthew as a person of interest and told the LA Times that his statements had been inconsistent and that he wasn't, quote, forthcoming with details about his whereabouts the night his daughter disappeared. They also released the make and model of Matthew's truck, a blue 1990 Chevy pickup, to the media, hoping it would generate new leads. Search efforts continued across Happy Valley, Anderson, and Shasta County, and 8 days after Ember was reported missing, searchers found Ember's pacifier right off Platina Road, miles from where Matthew had told authorities he had been on July 1st. Jamie later told Crime Watch Daily that was the moment she knew, quote, something was wrong. She asked, quote, why would her pacifier be all the way out in practically the middle of nowhere? The pacifier was sent off for testing to confirm that it was Ember's, and police asked Matthew to come in for further questioning. According to his mother Sheila, they arranged a time to meet on July 11th, but Matthew didn't want to go. He told her, quote, Mom, if they put me back in jail, how can I look for Ember? How can I prove I didn't do this? Sheila said she wanted him to go to clear his name. So on the 11th, Sheila drove Matthew to his interview and waited for him outside, but after some time, she realized that he had never gone inside. When she checked her purse, she discovered that $400, her phone, and a gun were missing. She notified police, and they launched a search for Matthew. Now, obviously, this is a dangerous situation. I do have some questions. I don't have all the details, so I won't go too far down the road. But why is Sheila showing up to the police station with a gun in her purse? I don't really have the answer to that question. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation. Obviously, I believe everyone has the right to protect themselves, but why the need to bring it there? It's just, I don't really follow it completely, but based on what I have found, it does seem like she was at least coming with some good faith. It does seem like she dropped him off there with the plan on him going inside and quote unquote clearing his name. So maybe it was just a mistake on her part, but this is now a very dangerous situation. You have a person of interest who doesn't have much to lose, who is now in possession of a firearm. So not only is he a danger to the community, he's also a danger to law enforcement who's going to attempt to apprehend him. So the situation just got a lot more dangerous. The next day, KRCR reported that Matthew was spotted in Shasta Lake at a Shell gas station on Cascade Boulevard around 3:30 p.m. Surveillance footage showed him buying cigarettes and a drink. Law enforcement urged the public to be on the lookout for him, but he wasn't seen again until the next morning. So what happened here is at 6:15 a.m. on July 13th, Michael Pardo stepped outside his home on Cottage Avenue to get his paper. Now this home was approximately a mile away from the gas station where Matthew had last been seen. Now as he looked around, he noticed that the gate to his backyard was open and some of the furniture was placed in different locations than it had been the night before. So at this point, he calls out to his wife. And that's when Matthew stepped out. Michael later told the LA Times, quote, "I knew who he was. I thought he was going to shoot us." And he almost called Matthew by his name, but he decided to act as if he didn't know him, which was probably the right move. And thankfully, Matthew didn't pull his gun. Instead, he told the couple he was taking their gray Buick Lucerne, and before leaving, he issued a warning saying, quote, "Don't do anything until noon or I'll come back." Now, fortunately, Michael didn't wait, and as soon as the car was out of sight, he called 911. And unfortunately for Matthew, the Buick had OnStar and GPS, which allowed law enforcement, including the Shasta County and Siskiyou County Sheriff's Offices, as well as the California Highway Patrol, to track Matthew's movements in real time. And while this is all going on, Matthew's mother, Sheila, is listening to the police scanner, and she's holding her breath because she knows that the officers are closing in on her son, and now she's just waiting to hear one in custody. That would mean that he's been apprehended and he's now safe. But that is a phrase that would never come. Authorities proceeded to close in on Matthew on Catherine Street in Dunsmuir. He broke into a detached garage and he hid inside while the homeowners locked themselves indoors. Officers quickly set up a perimeter. At 7:20 a.m., almost exactly an hour after Michael Pardo had encountered him, Matthew let off a gunshot. The police returned fire, and he was killed. The manhunt was over, but the search for Ember certainly wasn't. So this is a really difficult situation because on one hand, you're happy that any innocent bystanders involved are okay and that law enforcement officers are okay and that this dangerous individual is no longer a threat. But at the same time, you know that that threat is the only real lead to Ember. So with him dying, so does any chance of finding her, really, unless there's someone that he had told before the shootout happened. And that's what we need to find out. 5 days after Matthew's death, DNA results confirmed that the pacifier found during the initial search did in fact belong to Ember. But there was no evidence that she had been in that area, and no one could explain how it got there. The only person who might have that answer was now gone. So detectives kept investigating and they focused on the statements Matthew had made before his death. Now, he had claimed that he put Ember to bed on the night of July 1st, but detectives wanted to know if anyone had actually seen her after the gas station stop. Now, if you remember, Matthew's cousin Sarah adamantly told the police and Crime Watch Daily that she had seen Ember after Matthew's trip to the gas station. But Ember's mother, Jamie, said that that wasn't true. She claimed that Matthew himself had told her it never happened and that his family was more concerned about protecting him rather than finding Ember. Terrible, absolutely terrible if true. We're going to dive more into that right after this break. Ever wonder how much of your personal data is out there on the internet for anyone to see? Well, it's more than you think, I can promise you that. Your name, contact info, social security number, home address, even information about your family members, all compiled by data brokers and sold online. And as a public figure who shares a lot of my opinions online, I'm very concerned about the safety and security of my personal identification and the personal identification of my family members and friends. And as a detective, I've worked many cases of online identity theft, and there's one thing I can tell you, it's very difficult to solve those cases because the offenders often take steps to avoid identification. This is why I personally recommend DeleteMe. DeleteMe is a subscription service that removes your personal info from hundreds of data brokers. You can sign up and provide DeleteMe with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts will take it from there. DeleteMe will then send you regular personalized privacy reports showing you what they found, where they found it, and what they removed. And I love these reports. I look at them every month. It's good to see that they're removing it, but also unnerving to know that it's out there. And DeleteMe isn't just a one-time service. It's always working for you, constantly monitoring and removing the personal information you do not want on the internet. To put it simply, DeleteMe does all the hard work of wiping you and your family's personal information from the data broker websites. So take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for DeleteMe, now at a special discount for my listeners and viewers. Today, you can get 20% off a DeleteMe plan by texting DETECTIVE to 64000. That's 64000. Once again, text DETECTIVE to 64000. One more time, that's DETECTIVE to 64000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details. Okay, we're back, and I had alluded to this earlier in the episode that we were going to come back to Sarah's statements and the fact that in some cases, relatives will lie. And this is why, as a detective, you always have to try and corroborate any statements made, especially by people who have an incentive to lie for someone. Sarah is not an impartial witness. If anything, she could be an accomplice. She lived with Matthew at that time. But unfortunately, detectives didn't have much to go off of, so they had to take her and Matthew at their word. But this is a classic example of when they do that, you could find yourself investigating a wrong path. If the only person giving you information about the whereabouts of your victim is actually involved, it can derail the whole investigation. So fortunately, Jamie comes forward and she says, listen, that's not what happened. And now all possibilities are back on the table because initially you're trying to look at what happened to Ember after they got back to the trailer. Now you're asking the question, what happened to Ember when they left the gas station? And so now that you're going back to the gas station as your last point of reference for Ember, you have to re-expand your investigation. So the Shasta County Sheriff's Office asked the public to come forward with any information that they were aware of. And it's important to note that when they put out this public call for action, they did maintain that Matthew was the only person of interest, stating, quote, perhaps someone is out there who Graham confided in and who may be able to shed light about what happened while the baby was with Matthew Graham. I believe he probably spoke with someone. This would have been too difficult for him to keep to himself. But unfortunately, even with law enforcement reaching out to the public to help them solve this case, no one came forward with the information needed to find Ember, and the case went cold. So we're going to fast forward to 2016, around Ember's second birthday, where her family held fundraisers in the hopes of hiring a private investigator. And their efforts through the fundraiser led them to Philip Klein, a Texas-based investigator who decided to take on the case. And at the time, Klein told the Record Searchlight, quote, we're working very hard to give them any type of answers they need. That following year, he spoke to Crime Watch Daily saying, quote, I believe as a lead investigator in this case that we're looking at a death case. Now, is it a homicide? Is it an accidental case of maybe the baby wasn't medicated properly and had a seizure? Matthew freaked out and didn't know what to do? His statement seemed to offer a possible explanation, but Klein was very clear. He would follow the evidence wherever it led, and he was confident he would uncover the truth about what really happened to Ember. And unfortunately, I have to agree with Klein here. Although this is still classified as a missing persons case, it's not looking good. I'm always going to be honest with you guys. It's not. The fact that the person who was last seen with her took her in the opposite direction for almost an hour, her pacifier was found out in the middle of nowhere, and then the person with all the answers gets into a shootout with police. You can almost classify it as a suicide by cop. It's not where we want to be in the investigation. And I think Klein at this point is just trying to be realistic, not only with the community, but more importantly with the family. Now, there is another theory here, but I'll save that for the perspective. So while Klein continued to investigate the case, Jamie's family and friends created the Find Baby Ember Facebook page, and they regularly share media coverage, updates, and photos of Ember in an effort to keep her case in the public eye, which is exactly what I'm trying to do here. Every year on Ember's birthday, December 19th, a post is shared in her honor. This past December, it read in part, quote, "Happy 10th birthday, sweet baby girl. You should be home celebrating with your family. I pray every day for a miracle that will bring us answers and lead you home to us. Please know you are loved and missed." That post was followed by a poem written by Ember's aunt. The final post of 2024 read, quote, "Hoping and praying with all my heart that this new year will be the year that finally leads us to Ember. The year for answers and justice we desperately need. I love you, Emmy. Please come home." Unfortunately, that is the last update I have in Ember's case. She is still missing, and her family continues to search for the answers that will finally bring her home. All right, let's get into this perspective and elaborate on some of the things I had mentioned in the episode, because I know some of you may be looking at this and saying, why am I even here? What can we do at this point? Well, don't lose complete hope, because first off, this case happened in 2015. That means that science and technology was available, and maybe based on the investigation and what was gathered and what was retained, there's still hope. So let's first talk about two of the main scenarios. Well, we have three. The first one is that she was abducted. I don't think anyone believes that at this point. We talked about it being in that small proximity of that trailer, two people inside. Someone would have heard something. They would have woke up. There would have been an altercation, and who knows what would have went down, but at least people would be aware of it. But at this point, to think that someone snuck inside without being discovered by anyone, highly unlikely, I would almost say impossible. And before I get into theory 2, I want to mention theory 1B, which kind of goes along with the whole notion that she was abducted. There's also the possibility, just because I want to be open to everything, that because Matthew was hard up for money, maybe he sold Ember to someone, and that's when he left the gas station and he drove in the opposite direction. Maybe he was meeting someone out there and he gave Ember up for some type of money. But based on what we know, he didn't come into any money when he came back home. Her pacifier was found out in the middle of nowhere. So that doesn't line up, because whoever took her would have had that pacifier. So I mention this because I don't want to leave anything out, but I also want to be honest with you guys, and I don't think it's a viable scenario. So that leads us to the second scenario, and that's that this is a homicide. Something went down inside that trailer or in the car where Matthew intentionally killed Ember. And based on what we know about Matthew, doesn't appear to be the best guy, but it seems like he was on the trajectory, at least going in the right direction. And if he really wanted to get away from his responsibilities of fatherhood, he had options. He had his mother, he had his cousin, and most importantly, he had Jamie. So he could have removed himself from the situation. No one would have really cared, to be honest. And Ember would have went on to live a happy life with her mother, Jamie. So that leads us to the third possibility, which is that Ember had a known seizure disorder. She required medication twice a day. And we know that Matthew was not very responsible when it came to administering that medication. So is it possible that he missed a dose or two, which resulted in Ember having a seizure that went unnoticed, and she died from that seizure? Completely possible. So if that's what happened, Matthew realizes what he did and how he's responsible for this, and he panics. So instead of just coming forward and telling the truth and taking his licks, he decides to conjure up this scenario where Ember is abducted right under his nose. And nobody's really buying it at this point, but that's the best he could come up with, because he knew he was caught on camera. It's a small window. What's he really supposed to say? So he goes with that, knowing that most people probably aren't going to believe him. So where does that leave us? Well, that would mean that more than likely Ember was either already dead at the gas station, and maybe he wanted to be caught on camera, or she died shortly after that, maybe while in the car. He could have been going somewhere else and then realizes too late that Ember had a seizure and now she's dead. I don't know what to believe, but regardless of when she died, that direction that he headed after the gas station, that is the key to this case, because more than likely, that's where he disposed of her body. And I'm going out on a limb here, and this is a lot of speculation on my part, but I always think about GPS coordinates of his cell phone. So that's one thing I would want to make sure that investigators looked into, and I'm assuming that they did, because that may minimize the search area where Ember may currently be. The second thing that I would want to look at is obviously the pacifier. I think it's reasonable to assume that wherever that pacifier was found, it has to be somewhat in the vicinity of where Ember was left. I'm not saying it's the exact location, but if it would, let's say it was 25, 30 minutes away from where the pacifier was found, unless Matthew continued to just drive around for 20 minutes, this pacifier didn't blow down the road from the wind 30 miles. So I would think that maybe where the pacifier was found wasn't the exact location, but somehow, whether it was from the wind, whether it was from an animal, I can't even tell you. Something caused that pacifier to be in that area, and there's one thing we can deduce, that Matthew was in that area at some point. He had to bring that pacifier there, or he at least had to drop it while passing through that area. Why is that important? Well, this next part, I'm kind of stretching myself here, and you may not buy it, but let me just play this out and just entertain me for a couple seconds. We know that he left the gas station, and then he was seen an hour later on that same gas station camera. So what that tells me is that more than likely he couldn't have driven more than 30 minutes away from that gas station in any direction. Because if you do the math, even if he drove 30 minutes away from the gas station, it would have taken him 30 minutes to go back by that camera. So that's worst case scenario. So I would want to create a 30-minute radius. So how many miles could you travel in 30 minutes, make that radius, and then start to hone in on the area where the pacifier was found, right? So by comparing that information, both how far he could have traveled in that duration, couple it with where the pacifier was found, and then look at bodies of water, wooded areas, farms, etc., and see the plausible locations where you could dump a body that would not be located immediately unless you search the area. I know this is a long shot. I know it's a needle in the haystack, but it's worth the effort. And if it hasn't been done yet, it needs to be done. You need to get a detective in their car, drive out on the roads that they could have traveled, and see how far you can get in 30 minutes. And you got to do that in all directions. This is going to be a long process. It's going to take a lot of man hours, but Ember deserves it. So what if we do all of that and it doesn't lead to anything? Do we just close up our books and go home and say, oh, too hard, can't do it? No, we got to go down a different path. And I think this could actually be done concurrently. We have to go back to all the family members and friends, all the witnesses, and re-interview them. It's a strong possibility that Matthew disclosed some information to people he trusted. More importantly, it's also possible that Sarah has known what happened all along. So we need to squeeze her extremely hard because she was at that trailer. And if Ember died inside that 25-foot trailer, she more than likely knew about it, and she's choosing not to come forward. And if it's proven that she was lying about Ember being with Matthew when he came back home, isn't it also reasonable to assume that she's been lying about what happened inside that trailer before he left? Now, I'm not saying Sarah's guilty of anything, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that if it's proven she lied about Ember returning home, she could also be lying about everything else. And so I'd bring her back in, take another shot at it, and maybe not come at her from an aggressive approach, but more of the approach of, hey, listen, your cousin's gone, Ember's gone, but we want to bring her home. Help us do that. Be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And in addition to that, you got to go back to Matthew's mother and all his associates to see if he confided in anyone before going into this whole shootout with law enforcement, which again, I believe was a suicide by cop. I think Matthew knew what happened and he knew if he went into the police station, more than likely he was never leaving. And maybe there was some guilt as well, knowing he was responsible for what happened to his daughter and he would rather be with her than in a prison cell. I don't know. We'll never be able to ask him, but I have to tell you, I don't feel bad for him. It seems to me that this situation could have been avoided, and at minimum, it's negligence on his part. So in my opinion, there's still a lot of work to do here. In addition to talking to friends and family, law enforcement has to take another shot at the community. Maybe someone saw Matthew in his blue truck that day. Maybe there's a friend of a family member who got drunk one night and maybe said some things they shouldn't have, and they're just looking for that little bit of a nudge to come forward. Maybe some financial incentive. If we can get that money, that would probably help. But I'm hoping someone out there who has information finally does come forward. So to end this episode, I want to recap what we know so far. 6-month-old Ember Skye Graham went to her father Matthew Graham's house for an overnight visit on July 1st, 2015. That afternoon, he made a stop at the Happy Stop store in Anderson, California, but after leaving the store, there was an unaccounted-for hour. Matthew and his cousin Sarah later told authorities that he brought Ember home that evening and put her to bed. He claimed he fell asleep just a few feet away from her around 10:30 p.m., but when he woke up just after 5 a.m. on July 2nd, Ember was gone. Authorities quickly named Matthew as a person of interest, and 8 days after Ember was reported missing, her pacifier was found miles away from his home. The next day, Matthew went on the run, and his manhunt ended on July 13th in a fatal shootout. Detectives believe Matthew confided in someone about what happened to Ember and where she was, and they are still searching for that person. If you have any information about Ember's whereabouts, contact Shasta County Secret Witness at 530-243-2319 or the Shasta County Sheriff's Office at 530-245-6540. And if you remember, I mentioned a financial incentive. Well, I'm happy to report there's a $10,000 reward being offered. And my final words, as always, go out to Ember's family, specifically Ember's mother, Jamie. Jamie, I'm sure you've played a lot of scenarios out in your head throughout the years. Maybe you've thought about whether or not it was the right decision to let Matthew stay in Ember's life. But I'm here to tell you there's no way you could have known. And as a mother, it's only reasonable to want the father of your child to be in their life if he wants to do so. And I think most people would have done the same thing that you did, especially considering Matthew appeared to be turning his life around. And there's a real possibility that this was a tragic accident that was compounded by bad choices made after the fact. But at this point, I want you to know that although it may seem hopeless, there are things in this case that I believe need to be explored or need to be revisited. And I think through the use of technology, science, and also just some good old-fashioned police work, there are scenarios that can be explored that may narrow down the area where Ember may currently be. And if she's no longer with us, at minimum, she deserves to be home with you and the rest of your family. And I'm really hoping that you get that. I'm really hoping that sooner than later, as it's mentioned on the Facebook page, that this is the year you finally get the answers to bring her home. And I hope that by covering this case, my listeners and viewers will go over to your Facebook page and let you know that we are now with you for as long as it takes. That's going to do it for me, guys. Everyone stay safe out there, and I will see you next week.